loan, you have a little bit more flexibility to potentially pay yourself back.
So the 401k as a source of money can definitely help people out, but at its core, this is not what the 401k is for, right?
No, the 401k is a retirement account, and it's designed to help people save for retirement, and a growing number of employers are really trying to take the decision making out of the hands of their workers. They're automatically enrolling them. They're automatically increasing their savings rate each year unless the employees opt out. And the inertia effect is such that most people stay in and allow their savings rate to increase each year. On the flip side, because people often don't pay attention to their 401k, there are some people who maybe take on more debt than they would otherwise because the money's coming out of their paycheck and going into their 401k. So it's kind of a nuanced situation. And for some people, the 401k in this country has been also built with the idea that some flexibility should be built in so that people can reach that. For a lot of people, the 401k is where they save their money and they don't have a lot of savings outside. So I think there's also been an effort to ensure that people who really do need access to their money can get it in a pinch. If you're paying a 10% penalty, that's not ideal either. So they're trying to sort of give people carrots and sticks, but the idea and the goal is to help people save for retirement.
That's WSJ reporter Ann Turgeson. And that's it for your money briefing. We'll be back tomorrow with WSJ's Rachel Wolf to discuss how our expectations for how much things should cost haven't caught up with reality. This episode was produced by Ariana Osperu with Deputy Editor Chris Zinsley. I'm J.R. Whalen for the Wall Street Journal. Thanks for listening.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Shopify. The 1 Million Black Businesses Initiative, created with Operation Hope, gives Black entrepreneurs tools to level the playing field. Find an exclusive 120-day free trial at shopify.com/1MBB.
What's good, y'all? You're listening to Code Switch, the show about race and identity from NPR. I'm Gene Demby. On this episode, race science is embedded in our medical system. So what do we do about it? Okay, so let's say you're thinking about getting a new piercing, right? Septum, earring, maybe someplace more ouchy, maybe? And you go to the place and you get a little stab through your skin with some metal, such are the wages of being fly. And you got your dope new piercing, and it's shiny, and you're getting compliments on it, all that good stuff. And then some time passes, and oh no, you got a scar.
So most people, when you get like a small cut, it just heals right back up, and several months later, you can't even tell that you got a cut there.
But the scar is raised and maybe a little painful, and now you got to take your new piercing out to deal with it.
Other people, when they get a small cut or a puncture wound or a vaccination, get this really exuberant scar that forms, and that's called a keloid.
That voice you're hearing, by the way, it belongs to Andrea Dayro. Andrea is a medical professor, or more specifically,
the course director for pathology at Duke University School of Medicine.
And Andrea said the thinking has long gone that keloids are kind of a black people thing.
It's very common in the medical literature to say that African Americans or individuals of African descent have an increased risk of keloids.
There's this figure that's out there, that's been out there forever. Up to 16% of black people will get keloids. So Andrea had been doing a deep dive into how race was being used in one of the textbooks she used when she was teaching medical students. It was a textbook, coincidentally, that she was helping to edit. Anyway, each time that textbook referenced some sort of medical disparity based on race, she would go back and dig through the scientific literature and try to find out where that information was coming from. And one of the early examples she came across was keloids. And she thought, okay, this one's easy.
Literally, I was like, everyone knows they're more common in people of African descent. Everyone knows this. And a keloid is so boring to a soft tissue pathologist because we're looking at like really, challenging, things with chromosomal translocations and things like that. So this is going to be boring, and I'll find a couple of things and expand on it.
She started looking where a lot of doctors went. This kind of Wikipedia thing for physicians called Up to Date. Here's Andrea giving a lecture about it on YouTube.
Now, because of my work with my students, not only have I read Up to Date, which is always a great place to start, but I'd actually also read Reference 5 by Robles and Berg.
She starts actually reading through all the layers of references. What was the origin of that 16% number? Who were the references referencing?
At least 2 references that Robles and Berg are using.
And what Andrea thought would be a cut and dried lookup for this citation turned into kind of a quest.
It's not looking at Hispanics or blacks. It is looking at earlobe keloids in individuals in Turkey. And here are the 3 references they use.
It was one that took her back decades and decades.
From 1964 and Uluwatani from 1974.
She reached out to medical institutions and researchers around the world to try to track down the source of this number.
I actually had to email the journal office in South Africa saying, look, there's this paper I'm trying to find this 16%, and it may be in your paper. Can you send me a copy? I was like a dog with a bone. I went all the way back until I found it, and it was in a journal from 1931.
1931.
And that number had come through 90 years. And what had happened was, there was this meeting in Strasbourg, France, and someone was talking about keloids, a guy who's from the Belgian Congo. And he says, well, I was in the Belgian Congo, and I looked at, he looked at 1,205 black adult workers, and I counted the keloids, 16% of them had keloids.
Okay, so if you don't know the history here, the Belgian Congo was the site of some of the worst atrocities during the so-called Scramble for Africa in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Andrea said that this was the backdrop in which this European dude, a doctor, observed that 16% of the workers he saw had keloids.
And think now, that figure that we see in Up to Date, that 5 to 16%, this is where that 16% comes from. It comes from 1931, non-peer-reviewed literature from a meeting.
Again, one study, one dude, and here we are today. But Andrea said, okay, even if you want to wave away the very messed up social context in which this dude observed these scars on workers in the Belgian Congo,
You certainly can't say everyone from Africa or anyone of African descent has a risk of keloids.
Africa is the most genetically diverse continent on the planet. Like, genetically speaking, a random black person in the United States and a random white person in the United States might have more in common genetically than a black person from South Africa and a black person from the Congo. But back then, people believed that race was a biological fact with real, identifiable biological boundaries. And today, we know that that's just not true.
So here's what makes it even worse, okay? So on that very same day in 1931, someone else got up and gave his talk, right? And this was a guy who lived in Switzerland. And he was also interested in keloids. And he just walked around Switzerland and he looked at people there. And he looked at a total of, 834 adults in Switzerland. And he found that 13.3% of them had keloids.
Andrea said in practice, the difference between 16% of these workers in the Belgian Congo and 13.3% of Swiss randoms is
minuscule when you're talking about something clinical.
But over nearly 9 decades, the differences between how we see scars on the skin of lighter skinned people and scars on the skin of darker skinned people has become codified into medical textbooks. These ideas about black folks and keloids affect diagnosis and affect treatment. And the research she put into all this convinced Up to Date, the widely used reference for physicians, to remove the links between race and keloids. They did that in 2022. And so a bunch of the ways a doctor might handle treating your scarred up piercing, if that's been bothering you for this entire hypothetical, it might be totally different now. Andrea's obsession with answering this question about keloids and what she found was just one part of this ongoing project of hers to look into what other janky race science stuff is still infecting, no pun intended, the ways we think about race and medicine today. So I started asking Andrea about what problems she saw in the way race and medicine continue to be braided together.
So one of the things I think that most lay people don't understand is how much race plays a role in medicine. We teach medical students, and I learned as a medical student that certain races are predisposed or have a greater tendency to certain diseases. So, for example, we're taught that cystic fibrosis is something that we see in European Americans. And the problem with this is there are multiple problems. So one is that really pretty much anybody can get any disease. So there are people of African descent who get cystic fibrosis, and people from Latin America who get cystic fibrosis. And we're not doing a good job of identifying those people. The other issue is when we talk about something like sickle cell disease, and we say it's something African Americans get, African Americans are not a homogeneous group at a genetic level. And so to make assumptions like this is something that we do as clinicians. So if an African American child presents to the emergency department 4 or 5 times with a cough and a fever, that person might not be recognized as having cystic fibrosis. Whereas if someone comes in and they're European American, they'll say, oh, cough and fever multiple times, this child might have cystic fibrosis, and so we are able to make the diagnosis more clearly.
So, biological race isn't real. At least it has no biological basis in birth, right? So, what does it mean when people say something like black people are way more likely to get sickle cell than white people? Like, what are we talking about when we say those things?
So it's a heuristic or a shortcut, right? So we know that sickle cell disease originated in areas where there was malaria. So having that particular mutation in your hemoglobin gene is protected against malaria. So we actually will see it in parts of sub-Saharan Africa as well as Western Africa, which is where many enslaved Africans were taken from, which is why we associate sickle cell disease with African Americans. But we also see it in parts of Southern Europe, like Greece and Italy. We see it in the Middle East. We see it in parts of India. So when you have the mutation that causes sickle cell disease, right, that is a spontaneous mutation. So someone had that mutation in their DNA, and that person had a survival advantage. And was able to have children.
Okay.
So we have other mutations that have arisen in other parts of the world. So there are the thalassemias, which we can see in parts of Africa as well as parts of Southern Europe. So there are a lot of different adaptations that protect against malaria. But this gets really complicated because of population admixture. And so a lot of assumptions are made. You look at someone who has an appearance of someone who descended from Africa, and you say, that's an African American, that person's at risk for sickle cell. Well, it depends on where their ancestry is from. If they didn't come from an area that had that historically, then they're not at greater risk. It's really complicated.
If I go to a doctor's office and it's my first time at like a GP, they're using my racial identity as giving them black as a sort of, okay, we need to probably do an additional screen to see if this person has sickle cell trait.
Right. Well, so sickle cell trait itself does not cause significant problems. Mm-hmm. So you can have sickle cell trait and be really perfectly healthy. Mm-hmm. The issue would be if you were planning on having a child. Mm-hmm. You and your partner would want to get tested to see if that child would be at risk for that. For example, I have a friend who's African American, and she knows that she carries one of the sickle cell alleles. An allele is just a name for the type of gene. Mm-hmm. And her husband is European American. Mm-hmm. And so they were going to have a child, and she said, okay, you need to get screened for sickle cell. And he's like, but I don't need to because I'm white, right? White people don't get sickle cell. Right. Well, actually, a lot of white people can. And we can't tell by looking at somebody how they appear to us what their genotype is, what their genes actually are. So what happens is we have this vast oversimplification of who can get a disease and who is less likely to. And this informs how a patient is seen by their clinician. And this can have an effect on the appropriate tests being ordered, appropriate care being given. So that's a delay in diagnosis can be associated with what we call race-based medicine. And so race-based medicine is this idea that race is an important variable in your health, and that it's important for me to know your race because this will help me to know what diseases are more likely. Now there's a whole nother really complicated aspect to that. So what I'm really talking about, and what you referred to earlier, is biological race. So we know, and I want to make this absolutely clear, and you said it yourself, there are no biological races in humans. But we do have socially defined or socially constructed races. You're very familiar with that. That's what the census does.
Right.
And we cannot discount the impact that socially defined race has on humans, right? From exposure to toxins, lack of access to care, lack of access to nutritious food, increased stress leading to weathering, all of that. And so that can confuse the issue when we're talking about the importance of looking at race in medicine. On the one hand, we want to be sure we're not implying that there are biological races. On the other, we have to be aware of the additional burdens that some populations bear because of their socially defined race.
That seems like a really difficult demarcation to get people to sit with, right? Like, people are like, oh, well, because we know that black women suffer from weathering, right? I imagine a lot of people are like, who cares whether it's biological, whether it's this is a function of, you know, the conditions of living in the environment. Right?
So here's the important thing, right? If you think there's biological race and you see an unhealthy person from a subordinate population or from, you know, or from one of the groups that doesn't have access to everything, you're like, oh, they've got bad genes, or they don't take care of themselves. They have risky behaviors, right? So what that implies is it's that person's fault, right? The other problem is that if we say, for example, oh, and there have been studies on this, African American kids and Latin American kids in public housing, in urban centers, have higher rates of asthma, okay? And there are researchers who are like, oh, there's a genetic reason for it. Well, let's look at the environmental reasons. So we know that areas that were historically redlined have higher burdens of particulate pollutants that exacerbate or can cause asthma and respiratory illness. We know that there's more rodent and pest in the area that can cause allergens, can lead to asthma. If we say it's something biological, then we don't have to focus on cleaning that area up or taking care of those kids and making sure they have a clean, safe place to live. We're like, oh, they just have bad genes.
So it sort of changes the focus of where people put their public health emphasis, right? Like, if these are conditions that we can mitigate in some way, right? Like, then maybe we can actually do something about these health outcomes, right?
Right. So it's a question of blaming the patient or recognizing the role of the environment and saying we need to fix the environment so these kids don't get sick. One costs money and the other's easy.
Coming up, where doctors are learning this race-based medicine.
Just because it's in the textbook doesn't mean students learn it. They learn it because it's on the test.
Stay with us.
This message comes from Apple Card. You earn up to 3% daily cash on every purchase. That's 3% on products at Apple, 2% on all other Apple Card with Apple Pay purchases, and 1% on anything you buy with your titanium Apple Card or virtual card number. Visit apple.co/card calculator to see how much you can earn. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Terms apply. This message comes from NPR sponsor BetterHelp. If you had an extra hour in the day, how would you use it? BetterHelp Online Therapy can help you figure out what's most important to you so you can prioritize it. Learn to make time for what makes you happy. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Visit BetterHelp.com/NPR today to get 10% off your first month.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Shopify. The 1 Million Black Businesses Initiative is an award-winning program created by Shopify and Operation Hope, a commitment to start, grow, and scale 1 million Black businesses by 2030. Develop your business with award-winning courses, virtual workshops, and one-on-one coaching. Chart your own path for business success with the 1 Million Black Businesses Initiative and Shopify. Find an exclusive 120-day free trial at shopify.com/1MBB.
This message comes from Wondery with the new podcast, Black History for Real, weaving Black history's most overlooked figures back into their rightful place in culture and the world at large. Listen to Black History for Real on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Gene this week, Code Switch. So we're talking to Dr. Andrea Dayro. She's the head of the pathology department at the university, and for years she's been trying to help students and physicians unpack some of the messed up ways that they're taught to use race to make diagnoses for patients.
So, where are doctors learning race-based medicine, right? I mean, it's like someone has to be teaching it to them, right? I mean, I have a talk that I give called "Nearly Everything You Learned About Race in Medical School is Wrong," and I've given that with my colleague, Dr. Joe Graves Jr., about 70 times across the country. So, just because it's in the textbook, right, doesn't mean students learn it, right? They learn it because it's on the test. So in order to become a physician, you have to take a series of exams. These are called your board exams. And for MDs, for medical degrees, they have step 1, step 2. And the step 1 exam is one that tests your basic understanding of all of the basic sciences. So one of the issues is that the questions in the board exams test race-based medicine. And this is very well known. You learn these associations. And so what happened in this 2017 study by Rick and Braun is that
health statistics put the U.S. maternal mortality rate at a whopping 32.9 deaths per 100,000 births. Now, a team of outside researchers suggests that's way too high, 3 times higher than the real rate. The study was peer-reviewed and published Wednesday in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. What happened here? How could CDC's analysis have been so off? The authors of this paper suggest the culprit is a checkbox. A pregnancy checkbox was added to U.S. death certificates in 2003 to account for underreporting of pregnancy-related deaths, but it doesn't seem to work very well. CDC has acknowledged problems with the data and tried to improve its methods over the years, but Dr. K.S. Joseph of the University of British Columbia, the lead author of the paper, suspected the data still wasn't accurate.
We felt that the pregnancy checkbox was misclassifying a lot of such deaths and adding them to maternal death.
In the new paper, Joseph and colleagues disregarded the checkbox. They only considered a death to be a maternal death if there was a pregnancy-related cause mentioned on the death certificate, which resulted in the much lower rate. Dr. Veronica Gillespie-Bell is an OBGYN and the medical director of Louisiana's Maternal Mortality Review Committee. She was not involved in the study and says the findings don't surprise her. When her committee validates each maternal mortality case in the state,
it's very common that a 70-year-old man may have accidentally somebody checked the pregnancy checkbox, and it will appear that that was a pregnancy-associated death when it was more of a clerical error.
She says to her, the study is a call to action to support state review committees like hers that validate the data and investigate each death. She also points out racial disparities are still a big problem. In this new analysis of maternal mortality, Black patients are still 3 times more likely to die than white patients. Joseph agrees those disparities are concerning, as is the fact that these are still mostly preventable deaths, and each one is a tragedy.
Even if we say that the rate is 10 per 100,000, it does not mean that we have to stop trying. We have to prevent these deaths.
He says his study should not indicate to people that we can take our eye off the ball. Selena Simmons-Duffin, NPR News.
A titan in the fight for gay rights has died. David Mixner was an activist and Democratic political strategist working on JFK's campaign as a teenager, voicing his opposition to the Vietnam War, fighting over decades for the rights of LGBTQ+ people. All this work came at personal risk. In 1996, he spoke with NPR's Fresh Air about why he stayed in the closet until the 1970s.
Total fear. I mean, I thought that if anyone found out that I was a gay man, that my life as I know it would be over. I certainly knew and changed my dreams from the earliest days of my childhood, and started planning my life based on the fact that a good deal of the benefits of citizenship would be denied me.
Well, I want to bring in Brian Sims, a former Pennsylvania state representative. He considered David Mixner his mentor and his friend, and he wrote a tribute on social media to his late friend titled Legacy of a Titan. Brian Sims, welcome. I'm sorry for your loss.
Hi, Mary Louise. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for drawing attention to, as you said, the loss of an icon.
How did you two meet?
In the fall of 2009, I was working at the Philadelphia Bar Association, and I was working largely on politics and LGBTQ rights in the Commonwealth, and I got a phone call from David Mixner. It showed up as just New York on my caller ID, and I answered, and David, with his sort of booming voice, said, "Is this Brian Sims?" And he said, "I don't know you well, but you probably know me."
And was he right? Did you totally know who he was and think, oh my God, David Mixner's on my phone?
You know, I've said to him many times that I didn't. I was quick to Google him while we were speaking, and anybody that Googles David Mixner will find out that he's been sort of a part of every major LGBTQ, civil rights advancement of the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah. I was having a similar experience going back and looking at just how long, how openly, how fiercely he advocated for gay rights, and at a time when very few people did. Did he talk about what made him want to fight so hard to make it better and fight so publicly? He could have built a wall around a smaller life. He made the opposite choice.
The truth is, I think that David had a vision for the future at all points in his life, a vision for a future of equality where all people could sort of bring their full selves to their jobs and their families and their communities. And for LGBTQ plus people, that meant being out and not just being protected, but being respected.
We heard in his voice there talking about just the total fear that he lived with, particularly earlier in his life. Did he talk about that, about how he balanced speaking out with what he thought he might need to do to stay safe and prevent backlash?
I think something that David would tell you is that he sort of constantly weighed that fear against his activism and his advocacy, a decision that he sort of made each day when he woke up and approached new issues and new people and decided every moment that bravery was more important than silence.
One thing I was interested to learn as I was going through the many tributes to him is the very close and very complicated relationship he had with Bill Clinton. He pushed President Clinton hard to overturn the ban on gays in the military, which Clinton, of course, didn't do. He landed instead on this compromise that became known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Did you ever talk to David Mixner about that?
Oh, quite a bit. And when you went into David's house, you sort of saw pictures of him with all these great dignitaries, but there was also a picture of him standing alongside President Clinton in what's largely considered to be the first time that a president had stood alongside an LGBTQ person, sort of arms raised.
Regulate other uses, such as biometric identification systems, based on their potential risks and impact. If tech companies violate the new rules, they could be banned up to 7% of their annual global revenue.
Terry Schultz reporting. The governor of Massachusetts is moving to pardon hundreds of thousands of low-level marijuana convictions. Walter Wuthman of member station WBUR reports the move follows President Biden's call for governors to use executive power to clear past cannabis offenses.
Massachusetts voters legalized recreational marijuana in 2016, but many people still have convictions for possession on their criminal records. Governor Healy says her blanket pardon will apply automatically to the hundreds of thousands of people who are estimated to qualify. Healy says these convictions are keeping people from securing jobs and housing.
That doesn't sit right with me. It's not fair. It's unfinished business. Knowing we have the power to lift that burden, we should do something about it.
The action still needs approval from the Governor's Council, a colonial-era body that signs off on pardons and judicial nominations. For NPR News, I'm Walter Wuthman in Boston.
Wall Street ended the day in mixed territory. The Dow was up 37 points, Nasdaq down 87. You're listening to NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Melville Charitable Trust, committed to ensuring all people have a safe, stable, and affordable home that allows them to thrive. Information about ways to prevent and solve homelessness is at melvilletrust.org.
Good evening. It's 6:04, 74 degrees in Cincinnati, 72 degrees in Dayton. This is 91.7 WVXU. I'm Bill Reinhart. Cincinnati is one of 25 cities selected for the new Bloomberg Philanthropies Sustainable Cities Initiative. The city will get 3 new staff members to focus on the intersection of climate solutions and Black financial empowerment. Ollie Kroner is director of the city's Office of Environment and Sustainability.
I think there's a sense that right now, with all of this federal funding, you're rewriting the future. Right? There's a lot of shift happening, and is there opportunity to correct more than one issue at a time? And how do we be inclusive in this transition in a way that creates jobs, delivers solutions to communities that have been left out in the past?
Kroner says the team will work on 4 primary areas: green job development, support for minority-owned businesses, energy poverty, and climate adaptation in vulnerable neighborhoods. The team is expected to come on board in the next few months and is funded for 3 years. 4 other Ohio cities were also selected, more than any other state: Dayton, Columbus, Cleveland, and Akron. A new PBS documentary series, The Invisible Shield, explores the role of public health during the pandemic and features former Ohio Department of Health Director Dr. Amy Acton. On Cincinnati Edition today, she talked about the most trying moments 4 years ago.
Even at my house, when people eventually showed up, I had already had executive protection from March on. My instinct would have been to go out and talk to people because we were fighting every single day to solve problems that no one had solved, and there were people who were losing businesses and losing everything, and to hear from people what they were actually experiencing is normally what I would do. But when someone has, what looks like a machine gun in your front yard, you can't. And that's, I think, the sad part of that.
You can hear the full interview on Cincinnati Edition tonight at 8 o'clock or at WVXU.org. Mostly cloudy tonight, isolated showers possible, low of 52. Isolated storms and 73 for tomorrow's high. It's 74 degrees now.
This is All Things Considered. From NPR News, I'm Mary Louise Kelly in Washington.
And I'm Rob Schmitz in Berlin. The future of TikTok in the United States is less certain today. This morning, the House overwhelmingly passed a bill that would ban the social media platform, which is owned by a Chinese company, from all U.S. devices. If it becomes law, it could put an end to an app now known for all sorts of videos.
They want to ban TikTok, ban Google Sheets. I hate it. I don't know what the short.
Yesterday was Super Tuesday. Historically, this has been an opportunity for a huge momentum shift in the presidential election.
You're someone that has a hard time keeping your space clean or getting your space clean after a bout of depression, anxiety, ADHD.
Here to talk through this with us is NPR tech correspondent Bobby Allen. Hey, Bobby.
Hey, Rob.
So we've seen efforts to ban TikTok before, back in the Trump administration and also by some other states. Why is Congress trying this again?
Yeah, a few reasons. One, there is a lot of pent-up animosity in Washington over the threat that China poses. In terms of China spying on Americans, the country pushing pro-China propaganda, and potentially meddling in U.S. elections. And TikTok has come to embody all of those fears. Now, the obvious question, Rob, is TikTok doing any of this today? And the short answer is no.
But I guess lawmakers would say TikTok could theoretically do these things. Is there proof that TikTok is being used in this way at all?
Right. Well, lawmakers come out of classified briefings and say the things that they're hearing about TikTok does sure raise concerns, but publicly there isn't a lot of evidence, meaning there is no publicly available evidence that the Chinese Communist Party has used TikTok to spy or influence the public opinion of Americans, but China experts say it certainly is possible. And right now that concern, even though it's theoretical, it's enough to mobilize lawmakers because we're in a presidential election year.
Okay, so let's get to this bill. What does the House bill specifically do?
Yeah, the bill gives TikTok's owner an ultimatum: find a buyer in 6 months or be banned. Now, 6 months is not a lot of time in the world of mergers and acquisitions, so the company would really have to work at lightning speed to make this happen. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, Rob. TikTok's parent company in Beijing, ByteDance, has repeatedly said it is not interested in selling TikTok. We don't know yet what's going to happen in the Senate, but if a companion bill does pass in the Senate and President Biden signs it, which he said he would, the clock would start ticking for TikTok. If they don't find a buyer in 180 days, the sanctions start.
And so what does that look like exactly?
Yeah, there's no way to remove an app from phones that have already downloaded it, right? You can't just magically make apps disappear, but the bill takes aim at how people download TikTok on app stores. So it would become illegal for Apple's App Store and the Google Play Store to carry TikTok. Software updates happening all the time in the background will stop. That means TikTok will get glitchy and buggy, and eventually users will just get fed up with how bad the service is and stop using it.
I hear a chorus of screams from teenagers across the country. What is TikTok saying about this?
Yes, you do. TikTok is emphasizing the impact this would have on the economy, right? I mean, TikTok is a massive app used by many millions of people. Many of them are businesses, and it says if you shut down this social media app, it will have a far-reaching consequence for many people. And they also point to, civil liberties groups and others which say, this House bill tramples on the free speech rights of millions of Americans. And this sets up another important point, Rob, which is if the bill became law, there is bound to be a long legal fight ahead.
So, Bob, we've got a few seconds left. Say more about that. The courts have considered TikTok bans before, right?
Yeah, 3 courts have looked at this question of whether it's legally possible to ban TikTok in America, twice in the Trump administration, once when Montana tried. All 3 times, judges have said, no, it is a free speech violation. The national security case against TikTok is not sufficient to shut down this app. So the courts are definitely on TikTok's side, but we shall see what happens.
That's NPR's Bobby out.
Let's look now at an international boycott of American brands sparked by the U.S. arming and funding of Israel. NPR's Gina Raff reports on the boycott's effect in Jordan, where it is being widely observed.
It's not easy being McDonald's in this part of the Arab world. This is a drive-through in the Jordanian capital, Amman. Normally, cars would be backed up, but this rainy evening, there's only one. American brands in the region have been hit since October by a boycott protesting U.S. weapons shipments to Israel during the war in Gaza. Among the countries where it's most closely observed is Jordan, where a majority of citizens are originally Palestinian. Although McDonald's is quintessentially American, franchises are locally owned. But after McDonald's Israel donated thousands of free meals to the Israeli military, that distinction didn't mean much. The boycott is affecting all the big U.S. brands, and it's affecting Jordanian businesses and prompting layoffs. You can see the power of the boycott in local supermarkets. Normally the shelves would be full of Coke and Pepsi, but if you really want those brands, or other ones that are even seen to be American, you have to go to a separate cooler. They're still here, but there's a sign on the glass door saying, "Attention, this item is boycotted. The choice is yours." The increasingly popular cola choice is a Jordanian competitor, Matrix, which says it has doubled its production since last October. On a recent evening in bustling downtown Amman, the Starbucks branch there was almost empty. Next door, a Jordanian coffee chain, Astrolabe, named after the ancient instrument used to steer by stars, was reaping the benefits. Salah Hashemiyah from Oman was grabbing coffee with her sister.
All people in Oman not going for Starbucks.
So why Starbucks? And why McDonald's? Her sister Sarah said because those companies support Israel. Starbucks has no branches in Israel, but if Jordanians are wondering whom to boycott, there are apps to help them. Zayn Nadal, sitting with her mother and friend, shows us one called Gozanch, which means unnecessary.
So you can put any brand or product name, and it will tell you why it's boycott. Like, how does it support Israel?
The manager of this branch of the Astrolabe coffee chain, Rina Lake, who's 24, says it's mostly young people adhering to the boycott.
Because we watch a lot of things on social media more than our parents or grandparents, and we already support the Palestinian case before even the 7th of October.
Astrolabe now has 7 branches in Oman and is expanding to other countries. Company founder Moad Al-Faouri says business has increased between 30 and 40% since October.
In Astrolabe, one of our visions is to sell our culture. That's why I'm so proud of our shop that they are serving the Arabic coffee, the Arabic Bedouin coffee.
Laith, the store manager, says one thing they no longer serve is their American breakfast.
We used to call it an American-style breakfast because it has full-cut meats and hash browns and omelet. So we canceled that word.
Now, she says, they just call it the Astro breakfast. She says she thinks the boycott will diminish over time, but believes the damage done to the image of the U.S. in the region by the war in Gaza will be more permanent. Jane Raff, NPR News, Amman.
In the late 1700s, a woman named Bridget Atkinson collected over 1,000 seashells from all over the world without ever leaving her village in the rural English county of Cumberland.
So most of them are beautiful. There's a real range. There's some very tiny ones. There's some that have got a kind of a mother of pearl interior. There's lots of cowrie shells, which are often the kind of standard shell you might think of when you think about kind of tropical shells.
That is Frances McIntosh, a curator at English Heritage, the nonprofit that manages the collection. It includes shells gathered on Captain James Cook's final voyage, now on display at a museum in Northumberland.
The shells were previously believed to be lost until the 1980s when John Buchanan from Newcastle University saved them from the garbage.
This young lecturer, Dr. Buchanan, saw what was happening and managed to rescue them.
That's Richard Atkinson.
I am Richard Atkinson's great-great-great-great-grandson. I'm the author of a book about the Atkinson family.
Buchanan recognized these shells were from a wider, global collection, so he took them home where they sat in storage for another 40 years until his children found the shells in the attic and donated them to English Heritage.
Richard Atkinson says their history is complicated because Bridget Atkinson relied on a network of friends and family collecting shells across the British Empire.
4 of her sons were in Jamaica running the family plantations, which I should obviously add were run by enslaved people. And she also had a neighbour who was on Captain Cook's 3rd voyage.
After Bridget Atkinson died in 1814, her shell collection was passed down to her kids and her grandkids.
Until about 1930, when the living descendant of the time managed to gamble away his inheritance.
Richard Atkinson says most of the shells are still missing, but around 200 were found by Buchanan. To Atkinson, the collection illustrates how the smallest objects tell the story of the British Empire.
It provides a kind of bottom-up portal through which to see the great events of history, and shows how even a farmer and widow who was living a very ordinary life in a very remote part of England was part of that much bigger story.
And now, those pieces of history are on display for the first time in nearly a century.